Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Tammy and I'm the Siberian Wind. I would love to show you all about this quilt that's on my wall. Now these are just my blocks. I have not put my sashing or my borders on them yet. But these blocks are part of the pattern called Star-Crossed Path. So if you've gotten a pattern and you've been sent the link, or you have a link to this video from Star-Crossed Path, this is an official tutorial for that pattern. So let's hop over and let's go over blocks 1 through 6. Let's go. Okay, to assemble block 1 of Star-Crossed Path, that is what this block looks like. It is called a glorified 9-patch. So you do have you have a 9-patch here. So each of these sections are 9 patches, and then you have additional 9 patches in the corners that create this beautiful extra sashing effect, and it makes the block look a lot more complicated than it is. So let's go over what you're going to see in your pattern. In the pattern, it does provide you both with squares and with strips. So one of the strip sets to make the 9 patches at the corner is going to be what you're going to put as your center strip. Okay, then you're also going to have a strip set for your outer set as well. And you can the pattern is written with these all the same color. I had a variety of colors to choose from, so I improvised a little bit. Okay, so to create each of your 9-patch units that are in the outside corners, so you see this 9-patch unit here that is in this outside corner of your block, you are going to need to assemble strip sets, and then you'll follow the cutting instructions to cut your strip set combos apart. And I found that for my personal use, for the length of fabric that I have, the width of fabric that I have, I needed to make 3 of these strip sets and 2 of these strip sets. So these are the strips cut with the fabric according to the pattern. All of these strips are cut according to the pattern, and you will need to make 2 strip sets of this by width of fabric and 3 of this strip set by width of fabric. Okay, when you are sewing these long stretches of fabrics together, I do recommend that you use your walking foot. If you've never pulled your walking foot out of your box, now is a great time to do that. Walking foot is going to ensure that your fabrics don't move at a different pace. If you've ever done a jelly roll race quilt, or you've sewn long jelly roll strips together, you'll know that the strips can kind of become wonky and they'll shift, and you may end up with like part of your strips coming like this at the end, especially if you sew them all the same direction, which you do in a jelly roll race. So in order to avoid any kind of distortion, because you want these to come together beautifully, you do want to try to use your walking foot if possible. If you don't have a 1/4 inch marking on your walking foot, I do recommend using a seam guide or using a ruler to measure how far over to the right you might want to put your needle, to see if your needle can go far enough over to the right so that you have a 1/4 inch marking. By using the edge of your presser foot, kind of like you're used to using with your standard 1/4 inch presser foot. But if you don't have that, I recommend using something removable like washi tape or masking tape to mark your machine. A magnetic seam guide, a lot of people use a magnetic seam guide. That will not work if your walking foot is too far in the way and you can't put that magnetic seam guide far enough over to give you an accurate 1/4 inch seam. So that's why I recommend, in this case, probably some tape, just to give you a more accurate seam. So you do want to sew all of these strip sets together, and you're going to use that 1/4 inch seam. I use a scant 1/4 inch seam, so slightly smaller than a 1/4. It's just a threads difference between a regular 1/4 inch and what I use, okay? So it's not by much. Now, once you get your strip set sewn together, you're going to be able to cut these strips off. And the pattern does give you the measurements for cutting these strip sets. Once you cut these strip sets, you are going to sew them together, and you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam. Now, what I did, I don't believe there are any pressing instructions in here, and that's perfectly fine. You can press these open if you like. However, I find, especially when you're pairing a red with a white, it's kind of got the same problem as pairing a black with a white. You're going to see a little bit of shadowing on the white from your red fabric showing underneath. So when I pressed, I did press my seams on these strip sets with the white center. I pressed them out towards the red. And then on the strip sets with the red in the center, I pressed the seams in towards the center. Okay? So that is step 1 to completing this block. Okay? So your first step is sewing these strip sets together, cutting your strip set pieces apart in the right measurements, and then sewing them together. And you will need 4 of each of these in order to complete your block. So for this strip, you will need a total of 8 of these to complete one block, and you will need a total of 4 of these. Okay, so that's why when I did my measurements, I estimate that I will need 3 of these strip sets and 2 of these by my width of fabric, so that way I can cut what I need of those and still have enough to complete the 4 patches, or the 9 patches. Okay, so go ahead. That is the first step to assembling this block. So let's take a look at the next step of this block. There's still going to be a little bit more assembly before we can get to putting the block together. The next step of the block does give you a strip set piece as well, and I do recommend, I would probably need 2 of these if I did my measurements right. I did not have enough of my fabric, so I have improvised and I'm doing a little bit scrappier version. But you're going to have your white strip and your blue strip. Now in the pattern it is a much lighter blue. I substituted for a very dark blue. That's going to match kind of the theme that I'm going with Quilt of Valor theme. And so you will need a total of 4 of those. So the instructions give you measurements for your white strip that you will need, and it gives you a measurement for your rectangles that you cut here. You can cut those as width of fabric. Okay, so you could do a strip set and then be able to cut these apart. That's what I was estimating I would do. If I was doing this from width of fabric, I would estimate that I need 2 strips. So if you do have one fabric that you're going to use throughout, you could do 1 strip set. So I've used this blue for some of them. The other blue that I'm going to use is this. It's a very different pattern to the other blue, but it is still in that dark blue family. And I went ahead, because of the amount of fabric that I had, because I'm doing this scrappy. So the amount of fabric I had, I could cut my pieces the exact size. So I do have my strip set of my white, or my strip of my white. So what I will end up doing is I will lay these rectangles on this strip set to feed them through the machine. Okay, and I will leave a little bit of room, so I will have a little bit of waste. I have plenty of this white, so if I do run kind of low on the white, I would be very, very shocked. I have quite a bit of it left over. I did buy a little extra, I believe. So yeah, you can line your rectangles up on here, or if this is one continuous strip, you can just sew this strip, and then once you press these, you want to cut the size that the pattern suggests. So these are all cut to the rectangle size that the pattern said. And here's my strip. I could actually go ahead and cut these to match each of the rectangles as well, and that would work as beautifully as the first option. So it's up to you which direction you choose. But once you have these assembled to your white pieces or your strip pieces, they will go in a rotating order, okay? So you'll always want to make sure that that white is towards that center. And the same thing that I did with the red, I did with these as well, and I'll continue to do with my other strips. I did go ahead and press these towards the blue, so press them towards the dark. And that was to make sure that I didn't have any shadowing. And then what is beautiful about this is that once I have everything assembled, when I do these 9 patches, let me move this back onto the camera a little bit. When I do these 9 patches here, I'm going to press these seams out towards the red. So this seam will press out towards this red, which will bury that seam allowance this direction. This seam allowance is going that direction, okay? And I know this may be a little hard to see on a white table, so I do apologize for that part. There's not much I can do about the color of my table, other than maybe lay some fabric down, and then I can't move things around as beautifully. Let me grab the other pieces so you're going to see how this is going to go together. So you're going to have your 4 9 patches out at your corners. So you do want to make sure that you put them, matching up with your blue rectangles so that they are going to match at your corners. And let me see what else I've got. Oh, that's the completed block in the way. Okay. All right. So here's these. And if you see, they're kind of matching up. They're not completely matched up just yet because these are still oversized because they are not sewn. Okay. Now in the pattern shows this fabric as matching these fabrics, and you can absolutely do that. But this is just a variation that I am doing, both because it matches my color theme a little bit better and because it's what fabric I have available, okay? So that is what your unassembled glorified 9 patch is going to look like. So you will assemble all 4 of these units first. Once those are assembled and pressed, you will sew this unit to this unit to this unit, this unit to this unit to this unit, and this unit to this unit and this unit. Okay? Then once you get done with that, I did press the seams on these outside edges. I pressed those in towards the blue. I pressed them in towards the blue. On these, I pressed out towards the white. So this medium red here does not show up as much, or this light red does not show up as much under this white as some of the other fabrics. So when you fold that out, it's not going to show up quite as much, okay? So you will assemble that. So you'll have 3 rows, and then you'll assemble this row to this row and to this row. That will create, if I can hang on to it, that will create this block right here. So you see it takes up a lot less room once it is all assembled. I think I actually like the extra checkerboard. I might have to play with that going forward. But that is block 1 of Star-Crossed Path. Thanks for watching. Let's go on to block 2. Okay, so this is block 2, and before you get panicked, this is an actual assembly that we're going to do today for the Star-Crossed Path pattern. This is block 3 right here. Block 2 and 3 are identical, except that they are in different colorways. So if you can see, the center block, the center star is white in this picture, or in this block that I have made. And then the outer star around that is in my darker blue fabric that I was using throughout the quilt. And the outer border, the outer side is a medium blue, okay? So it doesn't show up quite as well, at least not from a distance. Or if you're looking up close, you might not really be able to tell the difference between my blues because my blues are not super distinctive from each other. So we're going to make block 2, but block 3 is assembled the same way. So if you're looking at your pattern, we're going to start in the center. This is piece 9. You're going to have pieces 6 and 7 are going to form flying geese units. We've got it here and here. So what is going to happen is we're going to take and we're going to flip these squares over, sew a diagonal seam, trim off a 1/4 inch on the outside edge, and then we'll come in and put the other triangle on there, again sewing a diagonal seam. Then we'll trim off the extra, and these will both flip back and they will form a flying goose unit. So that is what these units out here are going to do. So even though they're layered quite oddly, they are going to form that center star. So I'm going to bring block 3 back up so you guys can see. So the first step of this block is assembling your flying geese unit. So this is a flying goose unit, and it is very identical to what we're going to be doing here. You're also going to have another flying goose unit out here in the outer star, and that is using pieces 1 and 2 from your pattern. So for my pieces here, I have chosen to use white as my outside edging. So I'm going to lay my dark red on top of those, and these are going to form flying geese units very much like these will be. So I'm going to go ahead and flip those over so you guys can kind of see where the progress is that we're making as we go. All right, so we have all of our flying geese units that we will make here in just a moment. So we have all of those. These are piece number 8, and they're just blank squares. They're just squares. Okay, piece 5 out here is also just a blank square. Okay, so we don't need to do anything with pieces 8 or pieces 5 in any of the 4 corners of the block. Okay, the other pieces that you've got that you see hanging out here, these are going to form our half square triangle units. So I've got white and I've got red, this dark red that we're using for this outside. So these are going to form the outside sections of our block. So we have a lot of prep work to do in order to get all of these sewn together. Now you can use whatever marking tools you like. You can use diagonal seam tape if you choose to do that. When you are doing a lot of triangles, I know it can seem fairly tedious to add all of the diagonal lines, but I do recommend drawing your lines. On this pattern, it comes out beautifully every time if you will draw your lines. So I'm going to slide things kind of out of the way so that I keep everything kind of in order, and I can come back to where I need to be here in just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and draw my line down the center of my darker square. And you're going to do this by connecting one diagonal to the other. Now on your flying geese, your process will be slightly different. So we're going to go over both of those. So I don't want you to panic just yet. There's plenty of time to get this right, okay? So I have connected one diagonal edge to the other, and I'm going to pair that with my square. Now, when you are sewing half square triangles in this pattern, you are going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of your drawn line. So when you get to the machine, you are not sewing on this drawn line. You are sewing to 1/4 of an inch on either side. So you're going to come sew down one direction, and then you're going to come sew back up the other direction. So when you saw all of my squares out here, you saw that I have all half square triangle sets here. You only need half of them for each block, okay? So as soon as you have 2 half square triangle units with your lines drawn, you are set for this block, okay? You will need additional pieces for the additional blocks. So don't panic, your cutting directions are correct. You do not need as many as you think you need, okay? So when it says that you need 4 pieces of piece number 4 and 4 pieces of piece number 3, the pattern is correct because with each of these you are making 2. So you don't need as many. Okay, now on your flying geese units, I'm going to do the same thing that I just did to my half square triangle units, where I drew on the darker fabric. Now, well, it's not the darker fabric in this case. This is actually my squares versus my rectangles, okay? Because you won't need the drawn line on your rectangles. You won't be able to see that. You do want to sew these with the diagonal or with the square on top so that you can see exactly what you're doing. Okay? So what we will do is when I get to the machine, I'm going to sew just outside of this line. I'm not going to sew directly on the line. I'm going to sew just to the outside, just a thread outside of this line. And I'm going to sew from this midpoint to the point down here. Once we go to the next step, we will also again sew from the midpoint down to the corner. I do not recommend trying to sew from the corner of your unit to the midpoint when you're doing flying geese. Although you can do that, I don't recommend it because it tends to be less accurate. So let's go get some sewing in and we'll go from there. Okay, I wanted to bring you back to block 2 as we're assembling this. Now, if you notice, there's a lot missing, but I wanted to show you how the progress of this goes. And this is the way that you can, if you like to chain piece and get a lot of things done quickly, this is the way to do it, okay? So all of my pieces like this are sewn already with one side of the flying goose unit, and that is how it's going to go into the quilt. So we still have to add our other side of the flying goose unit, and same thing for the outside piece as well. You've got one flying goose wing already on here, and so we're going to do the same thing to the opposite side. So you're going to have your leftover squares, so you've sewn half of them on, and you're going to lay your square on top, and you're going to sew again just to the outside of your drawn line. And I do, when I am doing flying geese like this, I do press my seams open, okay? So my seams will get pressed open on this as well. And then here is my outside unit, and we're going to do the same thing there. So this is already pressed open, as you can see. And so I will sew just outside of my drawn line, and we will trim away and press open. So just so you know, I have trimmed away my extras. So those of you who know, these are still big enough that I will use them. I tend to cut all the way down to very small sizes. So these are still big enough that I can use them. If they were not, they would go into my scrap bin to go for dog beds. They would go in as padding for dog beds for shelters. But these are big enough I can still get a cut usable piece out of them. So that is entirely up to you as to what you still view as cut and usable. Okay, so let me go over this unit right here. This is the this is going to be your unit formed with pieces 3 and 4. Now in the pattern, what we were doing, let me find, I don't have one. Okay, so what you start with is your piece like this. This is the piece that we drew a diagonal line down the center. And if you can see right here, all I have done is trimmed away the 1/4 inch seam allowance on that piece. Okay, so this came from 1 square of my white and 1 square of my dark red. And that is the colors that I'm using for this outside piece. When you get done trimming those apart, you will I pressed my seams open. You can press to one side. It will not make much of a difference, but I did press open because I do like the feel of this quilt block being very flat. So I did press them open. And as you can see here, you have dog ears. You have little bitty pieces out of the side edges. So you're going to take the measurements in the pattern and you're going to trim your block down. Now I do want you to notice on this block, I have a diagonal corner all the way to the edge and all the way to the edge. You can achieve that by taking your ruler with your diagonal line and making sure that that diagonal line is lined up with your piece. So you want to line that up so your diagonal line goes all the way to the corner of your piece. And I apologize for that. You will get a very clean trim like this. Okay, so you will use the measurements in the pattern to trim that up. Now we're going to sew these pieces on here, and when you guys see this block back again, I'm going to have all of this trimmed. And I do want to go over real quick because I did say I sewed just to the outside, and I wanted you guys to see what that looks like. So this is my drawn line on here, and I have sewn just to the outside edge of the drawn line. And you will lay your ruler on your stitching line and trim a 1/4 inch away. Then when you go to press this open, it will lay nice and flat. Now you might have a little bit of trimming because you sewed just to the outside edge. If your piece is not big enough, if it's not going to match your sizing with your center block, then you are going to need to trim that piece. So you can use these side blocks here as your height and your center block here as your width for your flying geese units. And when you go ahead and do those measurements, one thing I do recommend when you are trimming a flying goose unit, you want to make sure that you do not lose your point here. Okay, so you will want to make sure that you do have a 1/4 inch here at your point, and I always find the half of my measurement. So whatever this measurement is here for our width, we're going to find that half measurement, and we're going to use that line to line up this point and our 1/4 inch seam along this line, because we can always trim extra down here and out to the sides. If we got a little off or got a little wonky, that's where you want to trim, is you want to trim these outside edges and down here. You do not line your flying goose unit up to trim it based off of down here. Otherwise you will lose your 1/4 inch seam allowance and you will lose your point in the center of your block. So I'm going to show you guys again the block 3 that I did, because that one's already done. And if you guys look closely there we go. If you look closely, you can see that I do have my points all the way in to the center of my flying geese units, and you achieve that by making sure you have a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so you want to make sure that you do have that 1/4 inch if you decide you're going to trim up your flying geese units. And depending on how you sew, you may end up needing to trim, you may not need to trim. Just do that a little bit with your heart. That's the best way that I can always put it, is if you're going to notice it later, if you're going to be conscientious of it, if you're going to be bothered by it later, then you trim. If you're not going to be bothered with it, if you're more kind of like a Rob Appel type quilter, kind of carefree quilting, and not as worried about precision, then you probably won't want to trim. You may not need to, but if you are a precision piecer, then that's when you square these up. Don't square them up, don't do any cutting to your flying geese units until you have both wings on. There are specialized flying geese rulers out there, so look at your pattern and see whether or not you have a flying geese ruler that matches those sizes, or you can purchase something like that if you choose to do so, and that is within what you would feel comfortable doing. Alright, so I'm going to go assemble the rest of my flying geese units, and I will meet you back here and we'll go over the complete assembly and getting this block assembled. Okay, so let's finish up block 2. And so what I've got laid out right here is all the pieces you didn't have to do anything to. So we took our flying geese and we sewed those together, and I typically do a lot of what is called batch sewing. So I take and I sew a lot of these together, and I sew all of the blocks at the same time. So it takes me a little bit longer sometimes to get everything sewn, but I'm not doing one block at a time. So this is going to make your center star piece for block 2 of Star-Crossed Path. Then you're also going to have your flying geese for your outer pieces. Okay, and so those are going to line up identically to the flying geese that are in the inner part of this block. Then you're going to take your half square triangle pieces. Now, if you will notice what in your pattern, what you're going to see is that your straight edges of your half square triangle units are going to go towards these outside corners. This is really easy to get them rotated and get them turned around and not get them exactly where they need to be to make this star pattern. So just so you can see what it would look like if you got one set in there wrong, it's going to stand out. It might not stand out as much, initially if you're looking at it, but laying this out like that will encourage you to see where those aren't laying out, because you do want all of your half square triangles to form their own points. That is part of the appeal of this block, and that is part of what makes it more of a starburst block. So that is what we did have here in the completed block that we've got right here. Okay, and I do apologize about the outside noise. I have no control over landscaping crews. Bear with me just a moment. Okay, so this is your laid out block for block 3. Your blue colorway is actually block 2 in Star-Crossed Path. When you get this sewn together, so what I do, and this is entirely up to your personal preference, what I do is I will sew these pieces to each other, and I will feed this entire row into my machine. Then what I will do is I will come back when I am back at the machine, and I will pick up this next piece and I will add it into my set. So I will keep this all together. I don't get anything out of order that way, and I just continue attaching the next piece, and I do that until the entire block is sewn. If that is not something you're comfortable with, absolutely don't do it. If you don't feel like you can do that without getting things out of order, then don't do it. You know, make your life as simple as you want to. If you wanted to sew these 4 units together, sew these 4 units together, and sew these 2 together, then you have basically a 9 patch. So you'd sew these 2, and then you have your center piece. Then you would sew these 4 here, these 2, and these 4. So you would have 4 patches, 2 patches, 4 patches, but then you would have a 9 patch block. Okay? So that gives you an alternate method to assemble this, and it might be a little bit easier for you to keep them straight that way. You know, you could pick up all the 4 patches and sew all 4 of them, and then when you come to lay them back out, then you can make sure that everything is laying out the way that you want it to. Now, I pressed my seams on the top row. I pressed them towards the center. On the next row, I pressed them away from the center. I pressed towards the center, away from the center, and towards the center. Okay? That is what I chose to do with my pressing. That's what made sense to me. If that is not what makes sense to you, if you have a different idea on how you want to press everything, you absolutely can. You can press everything open. However, you may run into some issues with bulk here where you've got the 3 fabrics for your flying geese units coming together. And you're going to have that same issue here. So you could end up with a little bit of a bulk issue when you're trying to press open. So I prefer to let everything kind of fall where it wanted to fall a little bit. And that's what worked for me. So this is that block sewn together. Look at how stunning this block becomes. Okay, this is block 3 of the star-crossed path, and the blue version is the exact same procedure to assemble everything. You are just using your different colorway. So it is the same exact steps. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, we're going to clear the table, and then we're going to get started on blocks 4 and 5. Okay, so here we are with blocks 4 and 5 of the star-crossed path. This block is called the Rising Star. Now this is the colorway that I am doing for block 5. The red version is block 4. So this is my red version, if I can hang on to it. This is my red version for block 4. So you can see that there's 2 very distinct stars that come out in this, and we're using that same background for the entire block. So I did the same thing here. So this is my pieces laid out. You have your pieces 2 here at the corners. You're not going to be doing anything with those until the end of the block. Same with your pieces 5, as well as piece 7. Okay, so following your instructions, cut out all of your pieces. These are your blocks or pieces 1 and 3 to form your flying geese, and these are your pieces 4 and 6. So just like before in the other sections of this pattern, what I do in order to sew these units is I do draw a diagonal line on the back of my squares. I will sew 1 seam down just a thread outside of my drawn line, trim away my 1/4 inch, press that open, and then come back and attach the other side. So when you do those flying geese, this is what that is going to start looking like here on the inside piece. Now these flying geese are smaller than the flying geese that you did on blocks 2 and 3. So these are smaller flying geese. So they're a little bit harder to handle, but they're still, it's the same process, the same thing the whole way around, okay? So when you get out here to pieces 1 and 3, these are much bigger flying geese, but the same thing applies. You draw your line on the back of your flying goose unit. You can use diagonal seam tape, but again, I don't find that it gives the accuracy. Now, my fabric is very much directional fabric, okay? This is a wave kind of pattern, and although it really doesn't matter all that much, if one is turned one direction and one is turned the other direction in the finished piece, does that bother me? Not necessarily. It might though. But if it bothers you, take the extra time to stop before you go too far, okay? When you put a directional fabric down, so I'm putting this up and down, so my pattern is going this direction. When I pull this back after making my flying goose unit, it is going to be horizontal. So that is your key to figure out which direction you want your points to go. Now, please also remember, it's going to go like this in the finished quilt or the finished block. So if my direction is a definite one-sided, you have faces or you have, bunny ears or whatever it is that your directional fabric has on it, you want to make sure that if you are using a directional fabric, that you take that into consideration. So for my directional fabric, I did choose, I believe on all of mine, to put my directional fabric going up and down. So I sewed across, and then when I pull my flying goose unit back, it is going horizontal. So these are going to go horizontal. These are also going to go horizontal to the center star. So they're all going to form a wave around that star. So that was kind of the way that I chose to do mine. So I do already have mine assembled for this block. And so I do not have one of the blue ones already assembled, but I did just show you the red one, and I'll bring it back up here in just a moment. But it is very much just like the other one. Once you get this, this one I would recommend you assemble the center star, because there's no way to assemble this and not assemble it to a full piece. Okay, so you will assemble the center star, and it is a 9 patch. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, and 9 pieces. So assemble that center star, and then your block becomes another 9 patch. So you'll have 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so that is blocks 4 and 5. So the red colorway is what is labeled as block 4, and the blue is what is labeled as block 5 in this quilt. So this is blocks 4 and 5 of Star-Crossed Path. And all we have left is block 6 and putting everything together. So let's get going. All right. So now we're working on block 6 of Star-Crossed Path. This is what my block 6 looks like. So what you'll have is you'll have 2 background pieces. My background fabric throughout the whole quilt has been this white. And then what you have out here should be matching fabrics here, and you can do matching fabrics here, but I needed something a little bit different for what I'm going for my finished look. So I have 2 dark fabrics, my medium, which in this situation, especially on camera, does read as a dark, and then I put my light. Now you can rotate these 4 patches here and put them in any kind of order that you want. But I did follow the pattern, and my matching fabrics that are in my dark category are going the same direction. okay? So you're going to assemble your 4-patch here, your 4-patch here, and then once these are pressed, you're going to assemble them into a 4-patch, making your finished block. So let's go over the steps to get that done. So you will have in your instructions, you will have the sizes for your background squares, and you will also have the sizes for your other squares. Now again, please remember that I have altered my colors, so these may not match exactly to what you're going to see in the original pattern. But you are going to see a kind of pattern emerge. And so in these 4 patches, your dark is going to go across, and it's going to go across here, okay? So in order to assemble this, you need to assemble these 2 4 patches here and then assemble them together with this. So what I have done is I've gone ahead and done some of that for us. So here is my light with my dark, which is matching here, and then I have my medium with my dark, which is here. And you'll notice that mine are stuck together. I did chain piece, like I do on all of my quilts. I chain piece. And all that means is that after I've sewn these 2 pieces together through my machine, I've sent them through my machine, then I'm going to go ahead and line these 2 pieces up together and go ahead and continue stitching. And then after I'm done with that, I will go ahead and put my next set of pieces in and feed them through, and then again with the next set that I have, okay? So that's all that I've done to assemble these 4 patches. They're super easy. So you just assemble 2 together, and then what I did go ahead and press my seams towards my darks, okay? So my seam allowance on the back side of my light fabrics or my medium fabrics goes towards my dark. So when you get to the back side of your piece, you're going to be able to nest those 2 seams. So these 2 seams here, you're going to, if you send one direction and send the other direction, you will have a seam that will nest very nicely. And what I do is I like to spin my seams. So if you guys can see that, all of my seams go in what you would see as clockwise, and it is clockwise. So I have this seam going here, this seam going here, and going here. Okay, in order to do that, because I have both of these seams going opposite directions, this does not automatically press that way. And especially because you have them attached to each other. So what I do is I will take my seam ripper and I will cut that stitch in the middle that's holding them together. So they stay like this until I am done with this part. So once I'm to this part, I just cut that stitch, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my fabric the directions I want them to go. If your stitching is too tight for your fabrics to just fall apart, you can take your seam ripper and just get in here and pull the stitching. You don't want to cut into your seam, so you're not trying to cut your seam allowances that are underneath these, but you do want to just separate the fabrics so that when you do press them, they will lay completely flat. So that's going to give you a nice flat seam here. So when you do that and you have all of your 4 patches sewn together, or you have your 2 4 patches sewn together, and you're going to assemble them into a 4 patch, you can then do the same thing. So at the sewing machine, I will send this seam through, and then I will send this seam through, and they'll be attached just like I did for my 4 patches here. And I will do the same thing to this seam. So I will press my seams, and I'll actually press towards the light on this because you'll have extra seam coming that direction, and it'll be a little bit easier on the machine. So when you get done pressing those, on the back of your large 4 patch, you can then have another spun seam, and everything will lay nice and flat. That is all there is to block 6 of Star-Crossed Path. It's very easy, it's very fast, and it's a great way to end your blocks. You don't want to necessarily always start with the easiest block and work to the hardest, because then you might not want to finish your quilt. So starting with the blocks, if you sew all of them in order, when you get to this block, this will feel very much like really quick sewing and very rewarding sewing. So you can easily have all 6 of these done, and then you're ready to assemble your quilt. Now that we've gone over blocks 1 through 6, you now have the opportunity to put them together. So as you can see, this is block 1. My block 1 that starts on the top row is out of your sight, so I do apologize. My design wall is not big enough for the entire quilt. So this is block 1, and again, I don't have my bottom row either. My quilt is only currently 5 rows high and 5 rows deep, because that's as big as my design wall is. So you're going to see blocks 1, you're going to see your blocks 2 and 3, you're going to see your blocks 4 and 5, and then you're going to see your block 6. And the instructions in the pattern tell us to sash our rows, and then we'll sash them horizontally. You're not going to sash your outside borders. So when you have 6 blocks in a row, you're going to have 5 sashing pieces. So your blocks at this point are going to be 12.5 inches square. If you have not already squared up your blocks, this is the time to do that. So your blocks are 12.5 inches, so you're going to cut your sashing according to the pattern, and they're going to be 12.5 inch high pieces. So you're going to have your 5 pieces to sash your 6 blocks per row. So if you are doing all 6 rows, you will need 30 pieces of your sashing to go between your blocks. Once you've assembled that, you do want to take one of your rows and you want to measure. Even though we could do the math and figure out what our sashing should be for our horizontal sashing here, it is the best practice to measure what you have and cut to what you have. Now you can try to do it by width of fabric, but I will almost guarantee you your width of fabric will not be long enough. So you do probably want to measure your length, sew your sashing strips together, and then stagger where your sashing pieces end up having a seam. So let's say in this row here, my sashing ends up having a seam here horizontally. Then I might want it to have a sashing piece or a seam here or here. You know, I don't want it to be a sashing, I don't want to have a seam down the same point of each strip. So I do recommend when you go to do your horizontal sashing that you go ahead and sew all of your pieces together, just sewing them end to end. I am going to sew mine horizontally, so I'm not going to have a diagonal seam in my sashing, okay? I am going to have a straight up and down seam in my sashing. I am going to press my seams open in my sashing strips. So you're not going to sash the very top of your row, and you're not going to sash at the very bottom. So those you don't need to worry about. So you will have 5 rows of your horizontal sashing before you put your outer borders on your quilt. When you finish putting your outer borders on your quilt, provided that your measurements are matching what the pattern measurements are, and you've cut your border the size that is stated in the pattern, your quilt should come out to be about 85.5 inches square. Now I'm going to go ahead and I will put my quilt together as the pattern has said, then I'm going to take it apart. My quilt does not need to be 85.5 inches around. I have a very specific purpose for my quilt. It is going to be a quilt of valor for a distinguished veteran. So instead of doing an 85.5 inch square quilt, which is above the measurements recommended by the Quilts of Valor Foundation, I will be taking a row off. So I will have my horizontal or my vertical sashing put in. I will have my horizontal sashing put in, and then what I'm actually going to do is take the bottom row off, and I'm going to turn my quilt. So what you see right now is actually going to be turned 90 degrees to make it the correct measurement for a Quilt of Valor. So you'll get to see my quilt complete both in a full size measurement just as the pattern is written, and you'll get to see pictures of it with that extra row taken off. And that extra row is not going to go to waste. I am going to put that extra row directly centered on the back. So it will get quilted into the back of the quilt. And what I am probably going to do is in these wonderful 4 patches, because one of these will also be on the back, because one of each of the blocks will be on the back in that last row, I'm going to probably put my label in the 4 patch. So that is going to be a great way to go ahead and have that label permanently affixed to the quilt and make sure that it has that significance that it needs as a Quilt of Valor. So I'm very thankful that you guys have joined me for Star-Crossed Path, a pattern written by Mama J Enterprises. So thank you for being here and joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial as much as I have enjoyed filming it. Thanks. Bye.